Hello and welcome to another episode of the Community Relations Corner, where we discuss issues of concern to New York's Jewish community and our friends and partners all over the city. I'm your host, Michael Miller, the Executive Vice President and CEO of the Jewish Community Relations Council of New York, JCRC-NY. On each episode of Community Relations Corner, we're joined by guests representing the political, religious, economic, and diverse community leadership in New York, many of whom I've had the pleasure and honor of getting to know over the course of my tenure at JCRC. Together, we'll discuss current events impacting the New York Jewish community and its neighbors, as well as the state of our city, the state of our state, the state of our nation, and at times we'll talk about the state of the world. Today, I am truly excited to host, in honor of Women's History Month, someone whom I've known and long admired, the Honorable Ruth Messenger. Ruth is a former New York City Council member, the former borough president of Manhattan, and the former president and CEO of the American Jewish World Service. But currently, she serves as AJWS's global ambassador. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome Ruth Messenger onto the show. Hi, Ruth.
Hi, Michael. Good to be here. And just as a note, maybe we'll get to this later, but I'm also doing social justice work at Jewish Theological Seminary and at the Meyerson Jewish Community Center.
Yeah, well, the Jewish Theological Seminary is actually going to fit into my first question for you. I'd rather start, rather than interviewing you, almost like interviewing your parents. I had met your mother, may she rest in peace, many years ago, but your parents were quite involved in the Jewish community. Why don't you please, if you would, share with our viewers a little bit of the family history?
Sure. Well, I think in this instance, it actually starts with my grandfather, my mother's father. If you go to the 6th floor in Federation and look at the pictures on the wall, too many of which are of men, but leave that be. My maternal grandfather was the first executive director of New York UJA Federation. He left a rising career in the public school system. He was a graduate of City College, as were almost any Jews who went for higher education at that point.
Yes.
Became a teacher. He was the principal of PS 20 on the Lower East Side. So he was literally Harry Golden and Jake Javits and someone else's principal. And then he was appointed deputy superintendent of schools. And then he was asked by Felix Warburg and others to become the first executive director of Federation in 1917. And he did that for 3 years and then moved to the career that would earn him, that my grandmother thought would earn him some real money. So he went into something called the factoring business, which is basically banking for companies. And he did that the rest of his life. But pertinent to your question, he and my grandmother, his wife, and then my mother, their oldest child, and then my father were between and among them on more boards of Federation Jewish agencies than you can imagine. My father was on the board and the treasurer of the Jewish Home and Hospital board for 55 years. My mother was the chair of the board of the Jewish Child Care Association during its most complicated years of legal cases with the city of New York over whose responsibility it was to care for children, abused and neglected children. She did that while she had another job, which I know you'll get to in a minute. And I would say, in terms of longevity and some pride, my family has been on the board of Surprise Lake Camp since day one. My grandfather was part of the Young Men's Association at the 92nd Street Y that walked the land upstate and bought it. He was the first chair of the board of Surprise Lake. My mother was the first woman's chair of the board of Surprise Lake. I was the chair of the board of Surprise Lake about 20 years ago, and I remain on the board.
Yes, which is a federation agency.
119 years old.
Wow. So how far back does your family go? And we still haven't spoken about your mother yet.
It was my grandparents' generation. So my mother's family and my father's family that came to this country. You know, a lot of people say that, but if you consider seriously how old I am, that's fairly early.
Yes.
So the grandfather who was the first executive director of Federation, like some other foreparents of a lot of ours, never talked about his early life. We are pretty sure that he actually that he was not born here, but was brought to the Lower East Side as a baby. He did grow up on the Lower East Side. He lost a twin sister who fell out a window with no window guards when they were about 5. And he lost his oldest brother, who was supposed to be, in the style of those families, the supporter of the family, died of tuberculosis. And that was the point at which the family responsibilities fell to my grandfather. And my dad's family came here probably more or less the same time. My paternal grandfather came here alone when he was 16, so probably just around 1900, from the Jewish community in Emmett-Baden in Switzerland. And my mother always, so then you wanted to know about my mother. So there is a story here. I mean, let's do the end of the story first. My mother worked as the director of public relations, radio and television for the Jewish Theological Seminary of America for 55 years.
Yes.
She was, she got that job by a wonderful accident, which is worth talking about. Louis Finkelstein, who was the chancellor of the seminary.
Yes.
In its early, not its first chancellor, but in its early growth years, said at one point in the 1930s, I've inherited an American educational institution. I have the best rabbis and professors to teach young rabbis, but apparently to be an American educational institution, you have to have people who do community relations, like the JCRC. You have to have people who do public relations. You have to be running a whole institution. And he said, none of my rabbis or professors have any of those skills. And my board is not giving me enough money to hire professionals. So I'm hiring the really smart daughters of my donors, because they will come to work for nothing and they seem to know how to do this work. And there were 9 women. I don't think I can name all 9 anymore, but my mother was Marjorie Weiler. Your predecessor, as it were, Jessica Feingold, who did community relations for JTS for another half century, Harriet Catlin, Sylvia Ettenberg, Rebecca Common, Edith Levine. That's about 6 or 7 of them. I can't get all 9, but they are written up in the history of the seminary. And Cyrus Adler, who was the biggest beneficiary of the seminary, called them Finke's girls.
Interesting.
And they gave, anyway, that's how my mother got the job.
Yeah.
And then she became a quite important figure, and the way in which not probably the current listeners on this webinar, but the generation, my generation and the earlier generations, if you ask them if they remember being told to rush home from Sunday school to listen to the Eternal Light, they will all put up their hands.
Sure.
And my mother, with Mort Wishengrad and someone else who will come to me in a minute, was the co-producer of the Eternal Light. And I want to just say, because I say this all the time, I don't know, something you can do with the next 5 years of your life, but the story of the Eternal Light as a radio and television program is an amazing story, the roots of which I don't quite understand, because NBC radio and NBC television, even then a major United States network, got the idea of doing a piece of half-hour a week of religious programming to help that religion, Judaism, educate some of its own followers, but in a way that educated a huge number of non-Jews to what Judaism was all about. So it was an amazing program, which they managed to produce every week for years and years, first on the radio and then on television. So
if I remember correctly, and maybe my older brother or younger sister would remember, I believe that our father, my dad, Rabbi Israel Miller, was on Eternal Light on several occasions, and how we would gather around our tiny little television set to watch him. It was always something very special back in those days, getting on TV, much more than it is today with cable and now the web. But yeah, so
it's a big deal. We have a recording of all of the radio programs, which I want to say, although I've had this discussion with various chancellors, the seminary did not do a good job of archiving these programs.
Oh.
But at one point, when I was in the middle of the United States, and I don't remember who the rabbi was, but a rabbi whose synagogue I was speaking at said, you know, I have all the radio programs on a disc. So he gave me a copy, and my husband and I played them in the car that year. And the best part of them was that at the end of every half-hour program, David Putterman, who happened to be the cantor of my synagogue and had an appropriate cantorial voice, would say at the end of the program, if you would like a recording of today's program, send 10 cents to Jewish Theological Seminary. Every time he said 10 cents, we would burst out laughing. But anyway, the recordings do exist.
Considering the world that we're living in now, my sister Deb up in Massachusetts just WhatsApped me that she remembers she was in the Ramaz chorus, and they sang on the Eternal Light.
Of course, and the other thing the seminary did that I'm very proud of, and this there are copies of, is for, I don't know, Michael, 10 or 20 years, the seminary raised money every year from its donors for a full-page ad at the high holidays that appeared in the Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Wall Street Journal, about 5 other major newspapers. And it was a full-page ad with a message put out by the Jewish community that was indirectly about the Jewish community, but it was focused on this broader issue of social justice, which is how I was educated. So there's a very early one that talks about people as the stewards of the land that God gave us, and is basically an environmental pitch. There's one that starts with something about who she is and in the image of God that she's made, which is an attack against domestic violence, first ever done by any faith community.
Nice.
So
what year approximately was that?
Oh, well, these were all, I would say these were in the 50s and 60s.
I figured in the 1950s. And my sister said that she was in elementary school when she was on in the chorus. So I think it's very evident to me, and certainly to our viewers, as to where your value set was established. And I assume you also you grew up in Manhattan. Am I correct?
Yep, I grew up on the west side of Manhattan, and in fact, unlike almost anyone I know, which is why your questions about ancestry are interesting, both of my parents grew up in Manhattan.
Oh.
Every Jew I've ever met in any way, shape, or form in New York talks to me, including my former husband, talks to me about their Brooklyn roots, their Bronx roots. We actually started in Manhattan and never left.
Well, our family started in Manhattan. Both of my grandparents were born on the Lower East Side. My grandfather's older. My grandfather on Stanton Street and my grandmother on Rivington Street. But we grew up in the Bronx.
Right, that's much more common.
So what inspired you to go into politics, to end up as a New York City council member before term limits?
So what inspired me to go into politics was, the state of the world, although I would make it smaller. It was really the state of the city. I had moved back to the West Side. I did live in the Bronx for several years, and then moved back to the West Side in 1968, and was working on the West Side and worked with an alternative school, and became really immersed in things that will only have meaning to some of your watchers, but the history of urban renewal / urban removal on the West Side,
right.
The experience of a very diverse, we had a very diverse set of families in our small school, Black, Latino, and Caucasian. And I became really aware of the different experiences in terms of housing, in terms of daycare.
Yes.
While I was at the school, started on my own, really, lobbying the West Side elected officials who were in general very good, about some of the situations that we wanted them to pay more attention to. And then decided with a group of other parents, when our small alternative school closed in 1974, decided to run for the local school board. So my first entry into political life, although I didn't think about it that way because I had a full-time day job, was serving on the school board for District 3,
right,
where we were actually able to do some things to improve education. But that was a year in which I spent a lot of time lobbying local elected officials. And when our state assemblyman at that point, 1976, was Al Blumenthal, who was wonderful and decided for various reasons not to run for re-election, that I actually decided, okay, maybe this is what I was meant to do. And so I ran for the state assembly in 1976, and I lost to Jerry Nadler by 73 votes.
Wow.
And that sort of sealed my life. I then ran in 1977 for the city council, and as you say, I served 12 years on the council and 8 years as borough president, and then ran a losing race for mayor.
Yeah. So what do you remember? Like, what are the highlights of your 12 years on the city council and 8 years at the borough presidency? What stands out for you? We don't have all the time in the world, but there have to be a one or two achievements that you look upon with great pride.
So there are several, but you asked the question differently. What stands out? I want to give a little plug here for the importance of local elections, local politics, local service. We need more and more good people to run. That's the way to enter the political system. It's not a good system to enter from the top, in my judgment. But getting involved in campaigns, being a campaign activist, and then throwing one's hat in the ring for a city council seat is really, it means that I met people from very different backgrounds, very different parts of the city that initially I didn't know very much about, who were incredibly dedicated to the idea of constituent service and the idea of making change. We didn't always agree, but I want to do a shout out for their high level of dedication.
Yes.
In terms of what stands out, even though, to be direct, I was more progressive than the majority of the city council. So some of my great moments were putting together a losing coalition of 6 or 8 votes to challenge something that the mayor was doing. But in terms of accomplishments, I want to say I was in on the earliest days of planning the campaign finance system for the city, which is the most generous public finance campaign finance system in the country. And it's been made better and better by successive generations of council members. And with Council Speaker Peter Vallone, I was in on the very beginnings of that and had a lot to do with it. I was the floor organizer for the 1986 passage of the Lesbian and Gay Civil Rights Bill in New York City, which was either the 5th or 6th time that the bill had tried to be brought up, some of it before I got on the council, 3 times after I got on the council. So it was a pretty dramatic moment.
Very much so.
When we passed it. And then in terms of something that people actually know, I early on and with ease, I secured a landmark designation for Riverside Park and Riverside Drive. But later on, running through my borough presidency, and sometimes it felt like block by block, but I had a lot to do with the fact that you can almost, not entirely, but almost walk, bike, or skate right around the island of Manhattan next to the water.
Wow.
You can now do it every place. The biggest victory there was, which people will connect to, was getting them to build the path outside of the island edge between about 85th Street, I think, and 97th Street. If you look there, when you drive down the highway, the path is actually cantilevered out over the water.
That's on the east side.
No, on the west side.
On the west side? Really? I'll have to take a look.
Yeah,
Uh-huh.
but take a look. The only place where you can't go right next to the water, which we just lost, was for the 15 blocks where the United Nations is.
Yes, of course.
Where
Of
the
course.
United Nations thought it was a threat to have people outside between the UN and on the outside of the UN. So you have to come inland there.
Yeah. So are you still engaged in the political scene in some way?
Yes, I am tremendously engaged in both local and national politics. I really believe I believe in democracy, and I believe that democracy is not a spectator sport. And
I know, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I know that you were co-chair of Donovan Richards' transition team as he transitioned into the borough presidency in Queens.
well, that was just an extraordinary opportunity. I mean, I really, really appreciate that. He had called me when he knew he was running, and obviously the way that the election was falling out, he knew he was likely to win. So he called just to talk to me about what can a borough president do. And we
Yeah.
had a great discussion. And then 2 months later, he called me to be one of the 3 co-chairs of the transition team, which was really fun.
Yeah.
But I would say that it is a place in which you can get a lot of things done. He's going to get a lot of things done. I was proud of these things that we got done. And yes, the answer is, so I've stayed involved. I have candidates usually in most races. I spent a lot of time in the last, I don't know, 6 or 8 years working with groups that were paying attention to elections across the country.
Yeah.
So moving more women into elected office, getting some of the brilliant women who were, if you remember, were dressed in white in 2018 when
Sure.
we added a whole number of women to the Congress. And I've continued to be involved in those issues, but also to pay attention to who's running for local office, you know, on the West Side in New York City. And I managed to keep very nice relationships with members of the press. So I sometimes get a chance to talk to them about city politics off the record.
Well, speaking about relationships, I don't want to pass over that time frame, and you mentioned his name before. What was it like being an opposite number? You were a city council member, a borough president, an opposite number of particularly of Ed Koch. And I had my dealings with Mayor Koch. Some of them were successful. Some of them were not. Some of them were quite confrontational. So what was it like being in the position that you were in, dealing with a kind of larger than life figure like Ed Koch?
So I think it's a great question, because I disagreed with Ed Koch on several issues, and I wasn't afraid to say so. Now I want to say I don't want to be boosting myself too high. I come from probably the most liberal election districts in the country, on the
Right.
west side of Manhattan. So I was mostly, not always, sometimes I was out ahead of my constituency, but I was mostly reflecting the concerns of my constituency or getting support from them. Challenged Koch on several issues about the generosity of the city's tax abatements, about the lack of, which has continued, the lack of mayoral attention to the state of the schools. But I want to say, Michael, that 2 things are true. One is, unlike some other people that I've criticized in the many years since then, I always considered Ed Koch a worthy opponent. He wasn't always nice. We're never always nice when we're in confrontations.
Yeah.
But he appreciated that I was a person who knew what I was talking about. I mean, he might have said publicly she's crazy, but I mean, the point is, I knew that he knew what I was saying. We each knew that we had substantive differences of opinion when we did. And so he was an honorable opponent. And I want to say the other thing about Ed Koch, which I said then, and which I've continued to say as someone who disagreed with him often, Ed Koch, more than most of the chief executives that I have known, appointed people who he knew were smarter than he was in certain areas.
Mm-hmm.
That was not true, in my judgment, of some of our other distinguished city and state leaders. But, you know, when Koch appointed someone to be a commissioner, he knew that person knew more about the area than he did. He knew, obviously, that he had the ultimate power, but he listened to people who had substantive knowledge and experience. And that made it much more enjoyable to actually either work with them, or, as was often my lot, work against them. I also want to say, and
Yeah.
this is like a piece of history. But at the time, because as you said, he was a perfect thing, he was larger than life. Many people on the city council who disagreed with him were not willing to be public about it. And so my career, I make no secret about this, my career was helped going on becoming borough president by the fact that I became a go-to person to say something critical of Ed Koch.
Yeah. Well, you said just a moment ago that you were the most liberal, or you're in the most liberal district, possibly the most liberal political figure in the city council, et cetera. When did liberal become progressive?
Who knows? Those terms got, sometimes the people who are attacking you change the terms, but sometimes the people who are advancing our positions try to find a term that will mean something to people. Okay, I just got an word from an organization that wants to work on climate issues. Don't worry about it. It's in the state of Indiana. But they want to change the term climate change because it's become political and radicalized. So it's very hard to keep finding new language. So you're absolutely right. Sometimes it was liberal, sometimes it was progressive. I guess the distinction that I want to make.
Yes. Is there a distinction?
Well, I don't want to take those two words, but here's what I want to say, relates directly to all my subsequent work at AJWS. And that is, there is a difference between doing good work in the world in any area to make any kind of change and looking at the root causes and trying to go up the stream and figure out what's causing this. So, for example, to shift entirely, I know this is a later question, but the pandemic exposed great disparities based on race and class in our health system.
Most definitely.
With all due respect, those disparities have always been there. The numbers around the pandemic made it a focal piece of attention. Right now, the city is struggling, I want to say, I think absurdly, I think they could be doing this much better to get vaccinations into the arms of the poorest people in the neighborhoods where the pandemic is worse. But the real question for me is, what are we going to do afterwards? There is a light at the end of this tunnel. And what are we going to do to look at the disparities in our healthcare systems in New York? And I worry that too many people will be, oh my God, we got through that crisis. And we didn't do badly, and now we're back to normal. People keep asking me when we're going to be back to normal, and I keep saying it's not normal we want to be back to. It's like there are still changes to make in the system.
Well, we really don't even know what normal is any longer. That expression in the new normal. And in fact, we at JCRC have created a healthcare disparities coalition, a multi-faith healthcare disparities coalition, starting in the borough of Brooklyn, but hopefully successful there and moving to other boroughs. And we always deal with the crisis du jour, but after the day passes, what's the next day going to bring? So after this crisis passes, will there be institutional systemic change that will ensure that there are no healthcare disparities or that those disparities can be resolved?
That's exactly right. And so that's exactly what I'm saying to you, is that I think that I don't love the terms, but I think when we were using the term progressive, that's what we were trying to suggest, is let's look more systemically at the changes that need to be made.
Right. So we were talking about politics. I'm glad we did get into COVID a little bit. We'll get into it a little bit later, but you transition from the political arena into the not-for-profit arena, and became the president of American Jewish World Service. So again, leaving based here in New York, but looking at the world as a whole, as opposed to your district in the city council or the borough of Manhattan, or your desire to be the mayor of the city of New York. Now you're talking about the entire globe. What motivated you to move in that direction at that point in your life?
I lost an election.
That's simple, huh?
I lost an election. I mean, I had become, that's an accurate description in a way. I had become passionate, which I suggested a minute ago, about local government, about the city of New York, and about how much work there was to do. And as you were just saying, about how many disparities there were to address without much detail. The school board that I was on, this going back earlier than that, but the school board I was on, the school district that I was on the board of, ran from 59th Street to 110th Street. Might just as well have been two worlds. in terms of disparities in quality of education, and that made no sense to me. So I lost an election, and I want to say there was a two-step process, Michael.
Yeah.
I first imagined that I realized that I would be looking for a job because I had lost an election. And I first imagined that it would make logical sense for me to run a not-for-profit organization that had something fundamental to do with one of the areas of city life that I had been most involved in. Everything from the tax abatement budget to foster care. And I applied for some jobs in New York City, and someone pointed out to me that I was not going to get a job running a not-for-profit in New York that was focused on New York City, because Rudy Giuliani, who beat me nicely for mayor, was and has remained an extremely vindictive person. And organizations that might have thought that I would be a good CEO in other times were not going to run the risk of appointing me.
No, interesting.
That came as a shock to me, but I'm pretty sure it's true. So AJWS came to my attention through a woman named Maddie Lee, who was at that moment the head of the New York Foundation, and said, you should be looking at this organization. And there were a couple of false starts, but when I looked at the organization, pursuant to what you just said, it was like, okay, for 20 years, my life has been bounded by the Hudson River on the west and the Atlantic Ocean on the east, and there is a very big world out there, and maybe I could pay attention to it. And that's what attracted me first, plus the fact that it was a small organization. It had been small for about 13 years. From when it was founded.
Didn't realize that it was around for 13 years before you
Started in 1985, which for some Jewish historian, I'm working with one of them right now named David Kaufman, but some Jewish historian should try to figure out what was in the water, Jewish water in 1985 is the year that Mazon and Jewish Fund for Justice, which is the predecessor organization to Bend the Arc, and AJWS were all started in 1985. So I think it's actually some interest. But anyway, 13 years later, AJWS was still a $2 million organization. So I thought, this is really interesting because it's a new geographic sphere for me. It is either going to not survive as an organization, or it's going to have to grow substantially.
Yeah.
And so that appealed to me, and the fact, which became our hallmark, but the fact that we worked on these more systemic issues of human rights and social change in Asia, Africa, and Latin America and the Caribbean really appealed to me. And I want to be clear, all of those things appealed to me first. And then the last thing that appealed to me with a question mark was what it would be like to actually go work in the Jewish community on social justice and social change.
And so what was it like? And looking back at those years, those just extraordinary years of your service, what do you look back at again as with pride at an achievement or two?
Oh, well, the achievements are huge. So for a minute, I'll take the liberty of talking about those. I mean, I grew the organization over 18 years from $2 million to $50 million.
Wow.
With fantastic staff and support, and this endless opportunity, which really in some significant ways reshaped my life, to meet indigenous leaders fighting for everything from the rights of girls to go to school to the rights of farmers to get title to their own land and to stop multinational corporations from stealing their land and their water, and fighting for gay rights around the world. And I would say the vast majority of our grassroots leaders that we partnered with were people who were fighting for justice at some and sometimes at great risk to their own lives. And I know a lot of Jewish history, I know a lot of American history, but I didn't know lots of live human beings who were like, okay, we need to organize and fight for change. And yes, it's possible, which happened in a few occasions, that someone will show up at my front door and shoot me. So that happened. So we lost some leaders. But anyway, it was an unbelievably exciting, endless opportunity. And next piece of good news and small piece of bad news, it was phenomenal to work with the responsive people in the Jewish community. all denominations, I want to say that really loudly, all denominations across the United States who got excited about the idea of working across lines of difference,
Yes.
of working with different people, of having a chance to go and be of service in some communities, of having Jews be seen in countries where there are almost no Jews, as being a people committed to social justice. So that was unbelievably exciting, and that accounts for our build up and for the work that I still do at AJWS, which is work with rabbinic leaders interested in global social justice. But small ongoing problem. I found too many people in the leadership of the Jewish community around the country not really being able to be open to what AJWS did, not because it was not their key issue, that's fine, but because they operated too much, this is obviously my judgment, Michael, too much from a position of scarcity and a position of victimhood. Like, everybody hates us, so we can't do anything good in the world. That's ridiculous, and that's against Torah teaching. And, oh, we don't have the resources to help AJWS because we're supporting our synagogue. But I just found it not respectful of our real place in the world. And this is all articulated these days about asking Jews to be aware of the diversity of the Jewish community, but also to be aware of the huge amount of racism, Islamophobia, homophobia that comes also from these same roots of white supremacy and white nationalism. I want to be really clear that there were fantastic responses in and from people in the Jewish community, from somebody literally dropping into their shul for a bat mitzvah and suddenly discovering me as the Torah teacher for 12 minutes and coming up afterwards and being interested, to people who asked questions that showed how much teaching we had to do, at the time at which AJWS, which I'm particularly proud of, organized the Jewish community against the genocide in Darfur.
Yes.
I had people in the synagogues putting up their hands and saying, why do we care about Black children in Africa?
Right.
But I was more distressed, and I remain mildly distressed as I work in the Jewish community, about the people in positions of leadership who, I'm going to put it most pragmatically, I'd love to put it morally or Torah-based, but I want to say, who don't understand that these next generations of young Jews are motivated by working in the world for justice. So why don't, I'll put it that way, the biggest mockers in the Jewish community, embrace that, talk about their work. I have to do an advertisement for your staff. So Bob Kaplan is like a one-man interfaith crossing the borders effort, and he has been since the day I met him. I mean, I just remember, and I don't even remember what it was. It was not Darfur, but it was some natural disaster, some hurricane or tsunami, someplace in the world, and we were mobilizing immediately to do relief work and reaching out to come. And our central focus is not relief work.
I think it was Haiti.
Maybe it was Haiti, but all I know is that Bob Kaplan called me and said, if I bring together the UN ambassadors from the 4 countries where American Jewish World Service is doing service work, will you explain to them who you are and why Jews do this work? I cried. I cried when he called me. I cried when I got to do it. I've continued to work with him on interfaith issues in New York. I think he is amazing.
Yeah, he is. We're just so fortunate, blessed to have Rabbi Bob Kaplan and his team as directors of our Center for Community Leadership, our whole interfaith division. Bob has just done amazing things during the course of his tenure at JCRC, and I'm glad that the two of you have partnered. And as to kind of shift gears a little bit and look at the fact that the world continues to revolve on its axis and things change. What has changed? You've mentioned it, invoked it several times in the course of our conversation until now, women's leadership. What has evolved within the framework of women's leadership Are we on the right track from where we were when you first started in politics? Are we headed in the right direction with the proper trajectory?
Well, I don't think you I don't think you meant to do this, Michael, but I would say you asked the question so that I could say we're headed in the right direction. But I want to say, what I really want to say is we're headed in the right direction if you have 2 centuries. So the answer is no, we're not headed in the right direction. We're pointed.
I wasn't expecting any particular answer. It's more like
No, I know, but the point is we need some fuel in our gas tank. So I want to say, first of all, we've seen this in a lot of places, and this is not a pitch for any candidate, and not necessarily for my candidates, but nationally and across the country, we are voters are much more able to see women in legislative than in executive roles. That is matched and mirrored by the business community. And I'm sorry to say that it is sadly matched and mirrored and reflected broadly in the Jewish community. So you and I could name a bunch of Jewish social justice organizations that have started, as I said a few minutes ago, in response to the hunger and interest from young Jews in food insecurity, in coexistence schools in Israel. This goes all over. That lots of organizations that have women CEOs, very, very, very few of them as big as we grew AJWS to be. But more fundamentally, this country has, you probably know the exact number and I don't, 160 federations, 20 large city federations. None of them are run by women. And in the history of my time and involvement in the Jewish community, since I started at AJWS 25 years ago, there have never been more than 2 large city federations run by women. And there's something crazy about that, really crazy. And when I say that, it's not only because, as Mao Zedong said, women hold up half the sky, we actually have brains of our own. But in the Jewish community, you know this as well as I do, women are the dominant presence on a great many lay boards. They're very serious workers for social change, fundraisers for organizations. They put in, as we say about board members, wealth, work, and wisdom.
Right.
They don't move up the chain. And when I have had conversations over the last 25 years, that would embarrass, I won't name the people, but I would be in a new city and they would say they were looking for a new federation director for some legitimate reason. And I would say, either name a person or say, like, aren't there some prominent women in your community? And they would say, oh, but this isn't a job for a woman. And I'd say, what do you mean? This isn't a job? I heard this more than once. And they would say to me, which was ridiculous, you don't understand, like a federation director has to raise money. So a federation director has to be able to meet with donors over breakfast and to meet with donors at cocktails. And that's too long a day and women can't do that job. And I finally got to saying, like, do these men, none of them have children? I mean, I just got obnoxious. But I think it's a serious issue for the Jewish community, is that we are not fully investing in the opportunities for women to rise to the top. It's true in politics, but it's also true in the Jewish community.
Yeah, but we're also in an era where the Vice President of the United States, Kamala Harris, is female. The Speaker of the House of Representatives, Nancy Pelosi, is female. And there probably are a few more women in the corporate world who have broken through the glass ceiling. And might it be under Kamala Harris's watch, modeling in an executive office, not president, but vice president, in an executive office, that more women are going to be stepping into corporate executive positions, as well as in the not-for-profit world?
Well, we would hope so. I mean, it's not for profit, it's for profit, and it's politics. And you picked up on the difference. Look, I think Nancy Pelosi's done the most amazing job of herding cats. I don't welcome anyone to that task. Just Chuck Schumer's job now in the Senate. But I think And I want to believe that Kamala Harris in an executive role will make more of a difference. And I'm nervous because I don't want it to be, oh, well, a woman can be vice president, but not president. When Kamala Harris was put on the ticket, I know a large number of people, you've probably seen this on Facebook, but people, Jews and non-Jews of color, bought onesies for their children. I mean, onesies and T-shirts that said, "The vice president looks like me."
Right.
And that's a key message. You can't become,
right.
or we can look at history, we can look at Jewish history. You can't become the head of X if you have no role models, unless you are really a super extraordinary human being who say, like, Moshe said, okay, I could lead the Jewish people out of the wilderness, didn't have a lot of models for that, but that's not common. So the issue is, like, who are the role models and how do we advertise them? And I made a remark before, which I'm going to repeat, which is, it's not just, what's the address? It's not just East 59th Street, 130 East 59th Street, that has a hallway of white Jewish men. It's almost every synagogue in the country. Now, I'm not stupid. I get that that's who has been the rabbis and the chairs of the board and the executive directors for a long time, but get creative. The Jewish Women's Archive can give you 1,000 posters of famous Jewish women. Why are Hannah Senesh and Emma Goldman and Stash Kotler, who runs Bend the Ark, why are not those pictures in our Sunday school and synagogue hallways? Because that's like the vice president. We want young girls to see them. Talk to people from Joy Levitt to Sally Priesand, who at some point in their lives said, wait a minute, a woman can be a rabbi? And then they had the guts to go do it. And we now have lots of women rabbis. And by the way, we don't have time to go into this, but I've talked to a lot of them to say that they experience undue and inappropriate amounts of sexism and harassment in their synagogues that synagogues aren't dealing with enough. So how do we engage? And it is, for me, a part of our job in terms of strengthening the Jewish community is use all the strengths we've got, one of which is women who aren't getting into enough.
So Ruth, would you want to see, you ran for mayor of the city of New York and were not successful. There's going to be a primary in June, which will probably determine who the next mayor is going to be. Is that a key factor for you as to the gender of the candidate? Or is it a combination, as I would assume that it would be, between the positions of the candidates and their abilities as well as their gender?
So for me, it always has to be a combination. And I'm interested in the values and policies of a prospective candidate. I'm interested in the gender of a prospective candidate. And when it comes to something like mayor or governor or president, thinking about our last president, I'm interested in demonstrated experience in the halls of government. So just as I said before, there are not enough people who get to rise up. Take New York City Council. I don't know the number today, but it's low. I think we got up as high as someplace between 25 and 30% of the council was women. And I know it's down now. And I know there's a campaign called 21 for 21, which is trying to get at least 21 women on the city council. That's phenomenal, because that's where those women have to start. And then you have to think about them becoming borough president or taking state office or moving up, because to be the president of the United States, pretty obviously, or the governor or the mayor requires, of course, a lot of things, but it does also require demonstrated managerial competence and knowledge of how the public sector works.
We're going to be running out of time soon. And a couple of questions I really want to throw in your direction. And one of them, we've talked about the evolution of women within positions of leadership. There's another evolution going on, and that's the role of Jews of color in Jewish society. And it's really taken a very long time for the Jews of color movement to take hold. Why do you think that is the case? It's also very interesting to me that many of the leaders in the Jews of color movement are women.
Yeah. So on the second point, I think it's because because given the whole nature of our society, American society as well as Jewish society, women tend to be a little bit more willing to take scrappy positions and fight their way up. When AJWS was $2 million, I got it to 50 million. I'm not sure that that's what somebody else would have done. That said, so well, look, we come in our own bubbles. This goes right back to what I said, is like you are what you see. So if if your Jewish life has been structured by geography, by your family, so that the only Jews you've seen are white Ashkenazi Jews, and the only Jewish cultural activities that you know are white Ashkenazi cultural activities, then you're going to be surprised to hear that someone is a Jew of color, and you're going to say, and by the way, I have Jews of color in my family, and people say to them, like, where are you from? Which is unbelievable.
Right. Yeah.
And it's unbelievable now because it's become clear that it's not something you should say, but people still say it. And they go up and they grill my granddaughter. My granddaughter was, I won't identify the players, but my granddaughter was grilled at her grandfather's shiva by a member of my congregation who I didn't see grilling her, is like, who are your parents? Because he couldn't understand how there was a young woman Jew of color who was one of the mourners. I mean, it was just like unbelievably rude and insulting and not thoughtful.
Very insulting.
So I think that's why. And let's go back to what we said about leadership. It's taken the leadership of a couple of strong people, from Ilana Kaufman, who runs the Jews of Color Field Building Initiative, to Yavila McCoy, who is an Orthodox Jew of color, who has a whole amazing family story, to this unbelievable woman. Just want to give her a shout out. Her name is Tamar Manasseh. She is a street fighter in Chicago. She is Black and Jewish. She's out of Caspar Fournier's congregation. She's seeking ordination in that movement, that small Black Jewish movement. And she runs one of the best street operations you've ever seen, fighting crime on the streets of the South Side of Chicago. And she says, people who come to write about me as a Black woman, but I'm trying to get them to write about me as a Jewish woman. So it's like what we open our eyes to see. But I think the field is growing and more visible. I'm infamous for when Ilana Kaufman was presenting the Jews of Color initiative at UGA Federation, and there were many disbelievers in the audience, and somebody said, after she made her whole presentation, I don't understand where all these Jews of color come from. I said, where I was sitting, but too loudly, it's called sex.
As you know, Ruth, I had two just extraordinary, amazing women of color on this show, Tamara Fish and Heather Miller. Heather is the president of her synagogue. Tamara was the head of a Jews of color organization. And I think that we're going to be seeing many more start sitting on boards, as well as taking executive roles within Jewish organizations. I'm very pleased to see that evolution within our community.
It was a great interview. As you know, I wrote you right afterwards.
Yes,
I've urged JTS to play it for the rabbinical students. Heather Miller is doing some work with Rabbi Stephanie Ruskay at JTS to advance her story. And Tamara Fish and I taught a course in race and racism at the JCC last year.
Really?
Yeah.
So I want to shift now back into progressive politics. And there have been many, myself included, have been very concerned about a move towards more radical position taking. The DSA, the Democratic Socialists of America, circulating a questionnaire for this New York City Council candidates, previously for New York State Assembly and Senate candidates, and asking whether you would decline a trip to Israel, educational trip to Israel, such as those, they didn't mention our name, but we're the only ones that do that at JCRC New York with our mission program, as well as being supportive of BDS. Is this of this trend within progressivism of concern to you?
Yes, I think it's very easy for people to go too far. I remember hearing about that and being glad I wasn't directly in politics or responsible for the Jewish community anymore. I just thought it was an absurd position. And I thought it was an absurd position because there's so much to learn from going any place. That's what I learned at AJWS. But I want to say, I should have said this much earlier, but it wasn't the JCRC exactly, but the JCRC, that's not true. I think it was the JCRC exactly. No, the JCRC was in Israel with a group of district attorneys from around the city and attorneys general. And I was invited to go to Israel with another group. You found me for a day and said, like, why don't you come with us? I actually am privileged to have sat in a coffee shop with Rabin, where he said Israel has to decide if it's going to be democratic or Jewish moving forward, and it's going to be a complicated decision. I mean, I remember that powerfully, and he spelled it all out. But on that trip, it was not the JCRC was my direct sponsor, so you're not on the hook. But I said to them, I'm excited about coming to Israel. It would be my second time, I think. But I want to talk to people with different positions. And I set up a meeting with a noted woman Palestinian leader, which was a fantastic meeting. But my sponsors from the New York Jewish community, not the JCRC, but they were hysterical. They were, I mean, I can't even begin to, they pretended to be only concerned about my security, but they came across as being concerned about my right to learn something from somebody who wasn't them, which was absurd. It's a fascinating country to be in precisely because of its history and its story. And it's very important to, meet the Druze community, meet the Bedouin community, look at where we are abusing people. Look at where every country, starting with my own country, I am a proud citizen of the United States. We have many stories of human rights abuses. I'm the best person. I mean, because I'm a citizen of this country, I'm in the perfect position to air them and argue against them. Because I'm a Jew who cares about Israel, I can make some argument there. But we have to own our complex stories. So I thought that position was ridiculous. But I also want to be sure that the Jewish community, which has a long history of being oppressed, fighting for people who are oppressed, being on different sides of different issues, as we thrive, because I think we are thriving in the 21st century, allows the maximum amount of room for differences in people and differences of opinions. So your program about Jews of color, very important, but people have to listen to the fact that Heather Miller was insulted in various synagogues trying to get Jewish education for her boys. That people have different ideas about how, which you and I are not going to get into here, but of course people have different ideas about how to resolve conflicts in the Middle East. And it behooves the Jewish community to create panels and programs where they can all be discussed. Similarly, I said on a recent panel, so I'm going to repeat it, we're concerned about, or some people are concerned about, this history and pattern of white supremacy influencing racism, influencing anti-Semitism. All the Jewish community should be doing, but it should be doing this, is holding panels that say, what is this idea of reparations? Where has it been practiced? Where has it been practiced with Jews in Germany? Where has it been practiced elsewhere in the United States? What might it mean? What does it mean that Georgetown University is giving scholarships to the descendants of the slaves it sold? I'm sorry, but that's biblical to me. They're not a Jewish institution, they're a Catholic institution, but that's a biblical story. And we have lots to learn from looking at these different stories and creating spaces that hold lots of different points of view.
Yeah, 100%. And the missions that JCRC takes to Israel with elected officials and others are introduced to people all across the spectrum, leaders all across the spectrum, from, of course, Jewish Israelis to Arab, non-Jewish Israelis, Muslims, Christians, Palestinian leadership in what's referred to as the settlement movement, going into the West Bank, into Judea, Samaria, into Ramallah. So we try to provide as broad a spectrum of experiences as possible. Just as in life, one should be exposed to multiples of experiences too. And this has been an amazing experience for me, and hopefully for our viewers as well. I'm sure that it has been. And I can't thank you enough, Ruth Messenger, for joining us on Community Relations Corner. Time has really flown by during the course of this interview. And I'm going to just ask you to pause for a second, think about a final thought you want to share with our viewers. And I just want to say something about our sponsor. In this case, it's the JCRC itself. So please mark June 23rd on your calendar for JCRC-NY's 2021 virtual gala, for which Ruth is on an honorary tribute committee. I'm so grateful to be receiving a special tribute on June 23rd as I mark 36 years of my service to JCRC New York and to the New York Jewish community. I'm also thrilled to be joined by my co-honorees, Ajay Banga of MasterCard, Ari Ackerman of Bunk One and the Miami Marlins, and Gus Lipman of Circadian Risk. For more information, please email gala@jcrcny.org. And now, if I can turn to Ruth to share just a few final thoughts with us.
Okay, a few final thoughts based on your early list of questions to me, which were very good. So democracy is not a spectator sport. Get involved, pick your candidates. We're picking all kinds of people in city government this year. We're picking another House of Representatives in 2022. Get involved. And for those of you who are thinking about running for office, run. It's a fantastic experience. Government is a place that can use our skills and know-how, so do it. But in any event, get involved. Never miss an opportunity to vote. I mean, never. Okay, that's one piece of advice. The second one, which I learned over and over again, and actually have a TED talk on the subject. I mean, a Dove talk on the subject, if you're interested.
Okay,
and that
yes,
is,
I am.
And that is learn to listen to people whose positions are different, and be respectful of where they're coming from. And the third one, which I feel like really passionately about, is when you do good works in the world, which includes giving money and giving time, please ask why, not why you do it. That's biblical and Jewish and human. Ask why the situations are what they are. Those people listening now who are parts of congregations that have community service for their bar and bat mitzvah students or do mitzvah days, fantastic. But ask why the situation is the way it is. Why are there people in the city of New York living on the streets? Why are there people who are food insecure in the richest country in the world? Why is the Jewish food pantry system, which is just phenomenal, have to do all of that work? And what are the things in our systems that ought to be changed at the city, state, and nation that would make for greater equity and greater justice?
Well, those are very, very important and meaningful thoughts to share with us. Thank you so much for that. But overall, thank you so much, the very, very, very honorable Ruth Messenger, for joining me and us on Community Relations Corner. It has not only been a delight, it's been a privilege. Thanks so much, Ruth. I look forward to seeing you again. Hopefully we can invite you back on, maybe as part of a panel as well. And as I said at the outset, I just so admire everything that you have accomplished during the course of your career, and much more to be accomplished. I'm Michael Miller. Thank you for joining us on Community Relations Corner. See you again next week. And shalom. Take care all. Be healthy. Be safe. Look forward to seeing you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you.